Hi, good afternoon. Welcome to this presentation by the Center for Law and Business Regulation at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. I'm Catherine Lacroix. I'm an adjunct professor here at Case, and I'm here to introduce the program to you. We have two wonderful speakers today who will present arguments based on their recent book, and then two additional speakers who will comment, and then we'll open the presentation to questions and discussion. So we're here today to focus on a compelling issue, global climate change and what to do about it. At this point, there is widespread agreement that global climate change is fundamentally different from the environmental problems we've confronted in the past and requires a fundamentally new approach. The question is, what will that approach be? Our opening speakers today are the authors of Breakthrough: From the Death of Environmentalism to the Politics of Possibility. They argue that in response to this worldwide challenge, we need to abandon the existing assumptions of the environmental community and move forward with a new paradigm of environmental protection. Their book has attracted widespread attention and public comment, and it's best summarized in one of many reviews, but I thought this one captured it the best. Breakthrough is a bracing manifesto, sure to launch a debate long overdue in the environmental movement. Whether or not you agree with its arguments, they need to be heard and contended with if we are ever to succeed in putting the fate of the Earth at the center of our politics. So I think you will enjoy hearing from our speakers. Our first two speakers today are Ted Nordhaus and Michael Shellenberger. Ted Nordhaus is an author, researcher, and political strategist. He's the co-author of Breakthrough and a prior work, The Death of Environmentalism. Over the past 20 years, Mr. Nordhaus has run major campaigns and initiatives for a large assortment of environmental and progressive political causes, including the public interest research groups, the Sierra Club, Environmental Defense, and Clean Water Action. He also served as the campaign director for Share the Water, a coalition of environmentalists, fishermen, farmers, and urban water agencies advocating reform of federal water policies in California. He's been executive director of the Headwaters Sanctuary Project and as a partner and political strategist with the Next Generation and Evans McDonough strategy and research firms serving political campaigns and environmental organizations. Michael Shellenberger works on and writes about everything from energy to technology innovation to changing social values. As president of the Breakthrough Institute, he is a leading national advocate for the development of cutting-edge clean energy technologies to achieve energy independence and restore America's economic competitiveness. He is co-author of Breakthrough and the Death of Environmentalism. Mr. Shellenberger has written for the LA Times, the American Prospect, Glamour magazine, and other publications. He has worked as a strategist for efforts to win action on global warming, save the world's redwoods, and improve working conditions for Nike factory workers in China. Our two primary speakers will speak for about 20 minutes, and then I'll introduce our rebuttal and commentary speakers. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and thank you all for coming. And we especially want to thank Jonathan Adler, who was going to be one of the commentators. We've really appreciated. I mean, I think it's probably the first time I've ever traveled such lengths to spend so much time with somebody who's so conservative. But we, for those of you that haven't read the book yet, we've relied in the opening chapter of Breakthrough on a very good piece of research and writing that Jonathan did about the history of the Cuyahoga River, and strongly recommend that history. It's a fascinating one, and one that we use to sort of context the larger discussion about global warming. And the argument that we make in Breakthrough is that the old environmental policies that we've inherited to deal with the new challenges we face, such as climate change, are inadequate, in that the older, what we call politics of limits, is no longer up to the task of dealing with big global ecological challenges, whether that's global warming or the destruction of the rainforests or species extinction or a whole set of other challenges. Ted and I actually met working on environmental issues in the late 1990s, and we were sort of struck by how ineffective much of the work that we were doing on global warming was. And we were kind of constantly asking ourselves, why are we so wedded to a particular approach to global warming, treating it like an older pollution problem from the past and seeking similar type regulations? And that was what led us to write The Death of Environmentalism in 2004, and then eventually Breakthrough, which just came out last year. So the argument that we made in the book, which I think got the most controversy, was that we sort of suggested that pollution regulation on greenhouse gases, the main cause of global warming, are not going to be sufficient, not going to be anywhere close to sufficient to dealing with global warming. And that really what's needed is a strategy to create the new energy economy through major investments in technology innovation. And this was a very controversial argument among environmentalists. We actually wrote it in the New Republic in September of last year before the book came out in October. We're sort of more gratified to see that we weren't the only ones making this argument by any means. In fact, just before the United Nations conference in Bali in December, a fairly little-known agency, but a very well-respected independent agency called the International Energy Agency, based in Paris, came and briefed all of the global diplomats that were meeting in Bali about climate change. And they wanted to lay out, well, how would you actually achieve what Kyoto negotiators and Bali negotiators are trying to achieve, which is a reduction of greenhouse gases worldwide by 50%. Right now, greenhouse gases are expected to increase by 50% by 2050. So what would it take to get that level of reductions? And the scientists, the analysts from the International Energy Agency presented this, and they said, well, here's what it's going to take. It's going to take 2 dams the size of the Three Gorges Dam in India. Some of you have seen photos of this dam. It's a massive construction undertaking. It's going to require 400 coal or gas-fired power plants that are able to capture and store the carbon dioxide pollution. It's going to require 30 new nuclear plants, 17,000 wind turbines, and 40 new biomass facilities. And it's going to require that not just once, but every year from 2013 to 2030. So you can imagine it's just sort of mind-boggling when you think about what a huge challenge this is. And what a different challenge this was. So if you actually look at what Kyoto was based on, it was based on older models of pollution regulation, and 2 in particular. The first was in 1990, there was the Clean Air Act amendments to deal with acid rain. And essentially what it required was that coal-fired power plants install scrubbers on their smokestacks. Fairly inexpensive technical fix. In the tradition of environmental technical fixes, we had catalytic converters on tailpipes to deal with smog in Los Angeles. Fairly inexpensive fix. The other model that Kyoto was based on is the Montreal Protocol, a global agreement to phase out ozone-depleting chemicals, chemicals that deplete the ozone layer in the atmosphere. And what people don't recognize about the Montreal Protocol is that that protocol was only made possible, in fact, attempts to have a global treaty on ozone chemicals actually failed several times. It only succeeded after DuPont had invented one of the substitutes, an inexpensive substitute for these ozone-depleting chemicals. And so what you have is you have an older sort of paradigm, or we call it a pollution paradigm in the book, that one of the entailments was a kind of a politics of limits that was just sort of grafted on a totally different problem, a problem that was different in the sense that we're not trying to just sort of remove a simple pollutant from the process of burning fossil fuels. We're actually needing to move away from fossil fuels almost entirely over the next 50 to 100 years worldwide. And the argument that we made in The Death of Environmentalism kind of comes in here to play, which is that support for environmental policies is widespread, but it's very shallow. It's very superficial. So, for example, there's a very widespread misconception that Al Gore's movie, An Inconvenient Truth, had just a transformative impact on public opinion in the United States. And while we agree that it had an impact on how we think elites view global warming, it had a very minor impact on the public. In fact, a poll was taken by Pew Center for Public and the Press, which is an independent, very well-regarded polling agency, and they found at the height of the publicity around An Inconvenient Truth, global warming ranked around 17th in a list of 19 priorities that the public was dealing with. Number one was, I think, the economy. Number two was something around terrorism and national security, Iraq, education, the economy. All of these things come before global warming. They went and did then a follow-up poll because, well, maybe something changed after the movie came out. So they did a follow-up poll 7 months later, and they found that global warming as a priority had actually declined to 19th out of 21 issues. And this comes as a surprise to folks. So, if you don't believe me, you can do your own research on Google, and you'll find it verified elsewhere. And in fact, when you go look at Gallup, which has been asking, do you think that global warming is real and that we should deal with it, you found that about 63% of the public said that they agreed with that statement in 1988. It was asked again last year, and they found that 65% agreed. So it really has been very little movement in public opinion. And you kind of go, well, maybe that doesn't matter. I mean, Nancy Pelosi and Harry Reid, and maybe a Democratic president, or even a Republican president, if John McCain, the likely Republican nominee, if they care about this, then they can get it done and pass through Congress. But there's a problem, which is that the dominant model to deal with global warming creates what we call sort of a Gordian knot. The way that the current legislation that's being proposed is called cap and trade would work is that it would limit the amount of greenhouse gases that companies are allowed to emit every year, and then it would reduce it somewhere around 2% a year to be able to arrive at a very large 80% reduction by 2050. And what that effectively does is it establishes a price for carbon dioxide pollution, and it makes the price of energy go up. That's the whole idea, is for dirtier energy sources to become more expensive so that clean energy sources become more cost competitive. But there's a problem, which is that many of those clean energy sources are much more expensive than fossil fuels. In fact, things like solar are 3 to 5 times more expensive than fossil fuels. And more to the point, things like solar and wind require huge investments in infrastructure because often the wind blows in places where there aren't that many people, so you have to transmit the energy to the cities a long ways away, and we don't have the transmission lines for that. In the case of solar and wind also, the sun doesn't always shine and wind doesn't always blow, so you have to have a way to store that energy, and that increases the cost of renewables. And so what you end up running up against is that lawmakers and regulators are going to be in a position where they're going to be asked to effectively increase the cost of dirty energy, and there's going to be a limit to the public's willingness to pay that increase. And when you realize that the dominant strategy being pursued by the major environmental groups is to effectively scare people about the seriousness of global warming and insist that they need to pay higher energy prices to deal with it, we think that strategy is going to run up against some very serious limits. So what would an alternative be? The alternative that we're proposing is that we not look at past pollution regulation strategies as the model, and in fact we look to something else. We look to a way to cut the Gordian knot around the trade-off between raising energy prices high enough to make clean energy competitive, but not so high that it triggers public backlash. Instead of trying to untie that knot, that we cut it. And that means that we would make direct, strategic federal investments in clean energy technologies themselves to bring down the price. And I'm going to leave it to Ted to describe a bit more about what those kinds of investments would look like. But what we really want to highlight here is that this is not about sort of spinning the challenge differently or reframing it. It's really about thinking about the problem as something fundamentally different than we've thought about past ecological challenges. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, Michael. And I think I'll cover a little bit, provide a little bit more context for what it means to think about that problem differently. And, as Michael mentioned, we wrote our original essay, Death of Environmentalism, and obviously our book as well. And sort of at the center of that argument is that at a sort of philosophical and conceptual level, environmentalism as a sort of political philosophy is not terribly well suited to addressing the nature of the problem that we're faced with when we look particularly at global climate change. The starting point for thinking about that is just to sort of understand the scale of the problem that we need to address and the scale of change that will be necessary to address it. So, you know, much of the narrative, I mean, interestingly, the inconvenient truth in Al Gore's movie was not that global warming was happening or that it was caused by humans. It was actually that we were going to have to sort of fundamentally change the way we live to address it. That literally sort of, I paraphrase it a bit, but that basically was, in fact, the inconvenient truth. You know, so start by recognizing that most of the growth in, and really most of the global carbon emissions over the next century will not come from wealthy, comfortable, arguably profligate American consumers and Western consumers. It will come from places like China and India. Despite all the progress that China has made, they still have 500 million people living in pretty abject agrarian poverty. India, similar numbers, maybe even more. Most of the growth of emissions is going to come from the developing world, who are sort of making a similar, taking a similar development path in the sort of most basic sense that we did, moving to a more industrialized, moving from agrarian subsistence economies to industrial and market economies, moving from rural agrarian areas into cities. You know, with that come a whole set of pretty basic improvements in living standards, from life expectancy to sort of prosperity to sort of a whole set of sort of basic political and cultural freedoms, even in ostensibly undemocratic states such as China. And in fact, you know, when we look at the global carbon challenge and global carbon emissions challenge, and we look at sort of projections from the IPCC that suggest we need to cut 80% emissions, 80% from what's from a baseline of sort of, they establish a baseline of what would happen if we didn't do anything, and then we need to cut 80% below that. Those projections actually, there's increasing evidence that dramatically underestimate the level of emissions we need to reduce, because they actually already assume levels of decarbonization through the modernization of energy sources that roughly double the levels of emissions reductions that they then say are necessary to reduce the climate. The level of emissions reduction, the amount of emissions we need to reduce is probably double or triple what all of the policy is actually based on. Now, even if you put that aside, it is our position that simply establishing what economists call a price for carbon, whether that's through a carbon tax or through caps and regulations, will simply not be sufficient to drive the deep reductions in carbon emissions we need to make. And that is because, as Michael noted, carbon, the differential in the cost of clean energy technologies in real deployed terms and the cost of current sources, even here in the U.S. and much more so in the developing world, is enormous. So we have estimated, and our sort of estimates are pretty consistent with estimates that others have made, that, for instance, for photovoltaic solar technologies to be competitive with coal, you would need a carbon price of roughly $200 per ton of, is it CO2? CO2. Yeah, CO2. Which actually means that that's the carbon price per ton of carbon versus CO2 would be roughly 4 times that. This is massively greater than even the most far-reaching proposals proposed in the U.S. Congress or really anywhere else in the world to deal with climate change. And in reality, the kinds of carbon prices that are being proposed are probably only sufficient at best if cap and trade really works the way that advocates of it suggest that it will work to reduce emissions 20, maybe 30%, primarily by driving increases in conservation and efficiency and what's called conventional fuel switching, so moving from things like coal to natural gas, but not a quantum leap in the amount of renewable and low carbon and zero carbon energy sources that we use. So the first thing to recognize is that cap and trade and pricing carbon, however you do it, are, and along with sort of regulatory approaches, are not going to get us 80% reductions in CO2 emissions. If we're lucky, they might get us 30% in the U.S., and all of that's largely irrelevant if you don't have a strategy to deal with China and India, which have made very clear that they are not anytime soon going to be willing to significantly increase the cost of energy, which is the sort of primary thing that fuels their development. And you know, there's a very well-established relationship between growth in energy use and growth in living standards. So to suggest that that growth in energy use in the developing world is not going to happen is akin to suggesting that significant improvements in living standards are not going to happen. We think of China as sort of this great enormous global warming BS detector. So when people talk about solutions to climate change, we suggest a very simple strategy for sort of parsing what really holds up to scrutiny and what doesn't, which is just add 2 words to the end of the statement, in China. So when someone says we have all the technology we need to reduce carbon emissions 80%, add the 2 words to in China to the end of that statement, and then ask yourself, do we have all the technology we need to do to reduce carbon emissions 50 or 80% or whatever the number is in China? Well, the answer is absolutely not. I think that's our critical point around all of this, which is that any strategy in the U.S. To reduce carbon emissions needs to focus more on how we drive the real deployed costs of clean energy sources down as rapidly as possible, not only in the U.S., but in places like China or India, or it will have very, very little impact on the problem. So that's not to say that we shouldn't establish a price for carbon, use regulations where they're suitable, and as we have advocated for many years, make big, big investments in the technology that we're going to need to make these reductions. But at the end of the day, the standard is not just are the technological solutions and are the solutions we're creating going to work in the U.S., but are we creating a framework where those things can work in China and India and the rest of the developing world, which is absolutely essential if we are going to actually stabilize carbon levels at anywhere near the levels that climate scientists are recommending. So how do we do that? Well, we think that, that it will require a combination of both what's called technology push and market pull. And it will require a major commitment to both. Our critique of the current sort of discourse and policy framework is that overwhelmingly has focused on the market pull. If we can just sort of get the market right, it will sort of drive investment from the private sector into these new technologies that we need, and that will drive them into the market and reduce emissions. But you would be hard-pressed to find any sort of major and credible review of the current state of energy technology and energy science that actually believes that's the case. In fact, every major review of this, from the IPCC to the Stern Review to major academic reviews done here in the U.S. at MIT, in Scientific American, elsewhere, has consistently found that sort of prices and market-based strategies alone will not be sufficient to broadly commercialize clean energy technologies at the scale at which they need to be commercialized. So our view is that in addition to establish a modest price for carbon, and we don't really care whether that's done through cap and trade or carbon tax. In fact, we think that cap and trade if that's the approach, would be well served by explicitly establishing what's called a safety valve, which essentially establishes a maximum price that carbon will cost. First of all, that establishes the conditions for market pull. We should set it at a level that's consistent with with current technology. In other words, we should not sort of fantasize that we're going to establish a price for carbon that's going to be sufficient to make photovoltaic solar power a real alternative to coal anytime soon, but rather that will drive the move towards efficiency, towards conservation, and again, the conventional coal fuel switching that we think can be accomplished. The other thing that's useful in this is that it potentially establishes a revenue stream for the level of investment we need to make, which the estimates range, but most serious reviews of this keep coming back to a range of somewhere between $30 and $80 billion a year. 80 billion, interestingly, being the roughly the same level that we spend on military RD&D, research, development, and deployment. If we're really serious about sort of dealing with the climate crisis on a sort of war footing, as some people have called, well, that's what it means to do that. The key focus of that investment, some of it needs to be in just sort of basic energy sciences. Back in the 50s and 60s, the federal government literally created the field of computer science largely out of whole cloth by making a huge commitment to funding these new science and engineering programs in universities all over the country. We need to then primarily, though, focus on sort of early stage demonstration and deployment, and then what's called commercialization and marketization. So this means establishing what we think is needs to be a broad portfolio of bets. You make a lot of bets. This is how venture capitalists function. You make a large number of bets, hoping with an understanding that most of them will fail. You need to create a framework in which you don't continue to sink money into bets that aren't paying off. And you need to create a framework where, while we don't want to lock in the particular bets on technologies that we make too early, that relatively quickly we need to start making some big bets on some specific technology, whether that's carbon sequestration, solar thermal, major offshore wind development. Additionally, we need to establish funding not only for the generation technologies, but for storage and transmission technologies. There is an enormous infrastructure that is going to have to largely be sort of built from scratch to support many of these new technologies. So if we're going to capture carbon from coal-fired power plants, we need to put it in pipes and pipe it off to somewhere where we can store it. Solar and wind are highly intermittent. That means we either need to be able to store those energy sources or transmit them across very long distances so that you can send energy from places where the wind is blowing right now to places where it's not, or where the sun is shining to places where it's not. These are enormous infrastructure commitments. Now, our view is that throughout American history, we've made these kinds of investments. We've made them often in conjunction with the private sector. So these have tended to be sort of a mix of public and private investment, where the public investment takes on the risks and the kinds of investments that the private sector either isn't very good at making or isn't inclined to make. For instance, privately funding a new electrical transmission system would be extremely difficult. Finally, we need to commit to do this over a very long period of time. These are going to be big, large-scale investments. We need an institutional home where we can make those investments well. Many people will tell you that the Department of Energy is not a good place to do that and has not had a good track record. I think we're a little bit agnostic. I think it's not clear whether the problem is the nature of the Department of Energy or whether it's the problem is the sort of nature of the kind of funding it's tended to get, or a combination of the two. But we are just sort of beginning to kind of lay out that framework, working with a whole lot of other folks. But we think that, you know, a technology-centered, development-centered, and investment-centered strategy is literally the only way that we will get to achieving large global reductions in emissions on any kind of time frame that's consistent with what we understand about the problem of global climate change. So.
Certainly, I think people in California have a different view of solar energy than we do in Cleveland. Thank you very much. We have, next we'll have commentary from Jonathan Adler, who is a professor here at Case Law School and director of the Center for Law and Business Regulation. He's the author or editor of 3 books on environmental policy, including Environmentalism at the Crossroads. And Ted Steinberg, who's a professor of history and law at Case Western Reserve University. He came to Case in 1996 after teaching at the University of Michigan and Rutgers. He has written numerous articles and 5 books, most recently a wonderful history, American Green, The Obsessive Quest for the Perfect Lawn, which is a terrific social history of the lawn in the United States. And he's written 4 other books also focusing on the role of nature in American history. One of these, Nature Incorporated, Industrialization and the Waters of New England, was a co-winner of the Willard Hurst Prize in American Legal History. He has twice been nominated for the Pulitzer Prize, and we'll be very happy to hear from both of them. Thank you.
You want me to go for it? Either way. Go for it.
Go for it. Okay. I don't know a lot about global warming, I'm afraid, so I can't really speak to that topic. I did read the book, which makes a very strong argument about environmentalism in its current form, and argues that it, not so much that it's dead, but that it ought to die, and on its ashes ought to arise a new political formation with a more positive rhetorical tone, and a respect for the role of economic growth, with state intervention, of course, in somehow righting environmental wrongs. The argument, and this is going to take us a bit away from where you fellows went there with global warming, but the argument in the book rests on a particular understanding of the history of environmentalism, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that right now. They argue, our guests, that environmentalism was born in the 1960s and not in the 1930s, primarily because of the rise of affluence in the post-World War II period. And I gather this ties into their larger argument, because presumably if rising wealth spawned the modern environmental movement, then the current environmental movement can somehow reincarnate itself, reinvent itself by recruiting to its cause a kind of new form of what they call a new form of economic development. That said, and you'll have to forgive me, I did actually find the argument made in the book with respect to the history of environmentalism to be a bit weak, and I have 2 comments in this regard. First of all, I thought the argument suffered from a kind of economic determinism that has been rejected by historians for about 40 years now, most famously by the British social historian E.P. Thompson in the 1960s. I think it's reductionist, really, to simply look at the history of the environmental movement as primarily a function of some sort of economic metric, like gross domestic product or some such thing, some sort of kind of economic measure. But secondly, and I think maybe more troubling in terms of the argument, is got to do with the question of timing here. The authors argue that correctly, that affluence was a post-World War II phenomenon, and that's, of course, true. GNP nearly doubled between 1946 and 1961. But as they also point out in the book, the environmental movement burst onto the scene in the 1960s, which was really as this golden age of American capitalism was already beginning to wane. So there's a little bit of what the postmodernists call sort of slippage in the argument here. They're correct, again, with their facts that with respect to affluence in the post-war period, and also with respect to the explosion of the environmental movement in the 1960s. If you take a look, for example, at Sierra Club membership, it took about 50 years, 60 years almost, to double between its founding in 1892 and the 1950s. But then Sierra Club membership doubled again between 1960 and 65, and it tripled between 65 and 1970. But again, there's a timing problem here. And I think it needs to be addressed. And it certainly begs the question as to why did the environmental movement emerge in the 1960s, which is, I think, one of the questions they implicitly pose in their book. And the answer there, I think, really doesn't have that much to do with affluence per se, but more with the conjunction of a set of historical forces unique to the 1960s that came together there, including, for example, the rise of liberalism. And I'm talking here about the writings of Arthur Schlesinger Jr., John Kenneth Galbraith, and others who incorporated environmental thinking into their work. The most famous liberal, perhaps, of the 60s was Lyndon Johnson, who, it should be noted, signed almost 300 pieces of conservation and beautification legislation during his term. It wasn't only liberalism that arose during the 1960s. This happened at the same time that women activists were becoming more and more interested in environmental issues. These women activists are the people that were buying Rachel Carson's 1962 book, Silent Spring. These women activists were the ones that were joining the League of Women Voters, which was making water pollution in the 1960s one of its critical goals. Liberalism, activism by women, again, unique trends in the 1960s, and of course the rise of the counterculture and the New Left also made environmental and ecological issues a major part of its mission. And it was the conjunction, I think, of these forces and others, but of these in particular three forces that I think explains why environmentalism emerged when it did, not affluence per se. None of which is to say, by the way, that you can't have, as they do, a critique of environmentalism in its current incarnation. And they argue, I think quite successfully, that most mainstream environmentalists are what I would call prophets of doom, who are trapped within what they also call a kind of place-based environmentalism. That said, as I see the history of the environmental movement, at least, it's not so much this place-based environmentalism that I think it's run aground on. It's rather run aground on a very peculiar understanding of what nature is. And when I say nature, I mean nature with a capital N. I'm not talking about plants, animals, climate, soil, or anything like that. I'm talking about the idea of something called nature. And I think what's interesting about the environmental movement as it emerges in the beginning in the 60s and carrying on through is that the idea of nature that's often put forth is an idea of nature as nature out there. It's not in your backyard with your lawn and your topiary. It's out there, meaning the equivalent of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge or the old growth forests. Right? We want to save wild nature, wilderness in some way. Now, needless to say, this concept of nature is a very middle-class one, a very bourgeois one, and it has tended to cut the environmental movement, in my opinion, off from, until recently, really, it has tended to cut the environmental movement, the mainstream environmental movement, off from the concerns of working-class people, such that by the 1980s, in the Pacific Northwest, you had trucks circulating around the roads there with a bumper sticker that read, "Are you an environmentalist, or do you work for a living?" That said, would seem to me that the mainstream environmental groups, which have a history of being anti-labor and anti-union, are anti-labor because they're pro-corporation. And I think there's a fair amount of evidence that suggests that, in fact, this is the case. If you look at, for example, what happened in the 1980s, especially in the 80s, and into the 90s, but in the 80s, the National Wildlife Federation under Jay Hare's leadership established something called corporate conservation councils, or corporate conservation council, and it charged corporations a $10,000 fee to join. A 1990 study found that of 7 mainstream major and mainstream environmental organizations found that their boards were well stocked with executives from companies like Monsanto, Exxon, Union Carbide. And if you want to really understand just how corporate indentured the environmental movement has become, all you need to do is chart the trajectory of Earth Day, which in 1970 was the largest demonstration in U.S. history against corporate capitalism, and which by the 1990s, Earth Day that is, had evolved into what the Wall Street Journal described as Marketing Day. What a true politics of possibility, which I'm all for, ought to look like, I can't really say. But at a minimum, I think it needs to somehow take into account these issues of power and the rise of the corporation to global economic dominance. Thanks.
Well, first, let me just say that I appreciate Ted and Michael making it here, and they're accepting our invitation to be at this forum. As an initial matter, I think their book is an important book. It's a provocative book. A lot of the things they say, it was important that these things come from individuals who'd worked within the environmental movement and worked with the environmental movement. And I think that if nothing else, the book will and should, and I hope it will expand the horizons of all those who care about environmental protection, and to provoke a lot of people to expand their horizons and broaden their thinking in terms of what it means to advance environmental protection, and to hopefully, at least in my view, reject the conventional environmental paradigm that has focused on limits and pollution control, as opposed to, or at the expense of the importance of technology and economic growth. In the climate context in particular, I think too often the environmental movement has found itself in a posture where it embraces the imposition of limits for their own sake, irrespective of whether or not they actually produce tangible results in our air and our water and the world around us. And in the climate change context, I think that is particularly clear because, as has already been discussed, the sorts of policies that are bandied about won't do anything in terms of changing the climate projections for what the Earth's climate will be like 100 years from now, won't do anything to change projected rates of sea level. They are simply too small. And even these small policy proposals that have been put on the table still seem economically, economically significant enough to not be adopted or enforced. At lunch, Ted and Michael talked about how in Europe, and this is very true, all the nations that signed on to the Kyoto Protocol are way behind in meeting their targets and their pledges to reduce their emissions. And if you exclude England and Germany, who have had reductions in greenhouse gas emissions due to exogenous factors that have nothing to do with environmental policy or Kyoto, Europe has actually been significantly increasing its greenhouse gas emissions and increasing them at a rate faster than the United States, even though the United States has done, as a practical matter, nothing with regard to climate change. The sorts of things, the conventional paradigm leads us towards policies that are significant enough to cause real economic pain and therefore to be politically difficult, if not impossible, to achieve, but doesn't lead us to policies that, at least in the context of climate change, can produce the sort of changes that we need to see if our goal is, in fact, stabilizing atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases. The other reason why I think their book is important is because it presents some of these sorts of problems, but without telling us that means we should hide our heads in our hands or duck under the desks and despair about the impending catastrophe and be nihilistic or pessimistic. It rather tries to set forth how we could reconceive these problems and reconceive what an environmental politics really, what I would characterize as a broader progressive politics that incorporates many aspects of environmentalism, but that goes far beyond that. And I think that's very important. I think it's very important to do because environmentalism in many respects, I think, has played itself out. I've certainly written things that make that argument. And so I think laying out this challenge and in many respects throwing down the gauntlet to those who care about environmental protection and are involved in environmental policy is very important. That said, I am skeptical about some of their particular solutions, and I want to very briefly explain why that is, and hopefully leave time so we can all discuss these issues in questions and answers. One of the fundamental problems, and I think it's a problem that even their politics of possibility still has to confront, is that just as we can't plan ourselves to economic prosperity, when we're dealing with real serious problems, not the easy problems like removing sewage from streams or establishing the first few wildernesses or putting the first scrubbers on coal plants, but the real problems, the parts per million problems, the part per billion problems, or in the context of climate change, the global atmospheric problems that we all contribute to in our daily lives, we can't plan ourselves to ecological sustainability either. If anything, that is a more difficult task. The planning requirements are just that much greater. And it's not just a problem with regulations. I think they note that this is a problem that in many ways plagues the regulatory system, particularly as we are dealing with the current generation of environmental problems that we're dealing with. But it's a problem with investment too. The reality is the government isn't a very good venture capitalist. There's a reason why venture capitalists do the things they do and get the economic rewards they do, and that government tends not to produce similar gains, and when it does, they tend to be accidental. In their book and in some other things they've written, they talk about how important government investment was in creating the internet, and that's true. But no one had any clue that that's what the government investment in what was essentially a technology designed for specific applications that the government needed for specific purposes would lead to anything remotely approaching what the internet has provided. The one time the government did try and do something like, or a government did try to do something like this, France tried to do it with these what they call Minitel communication stations. The reality is that when government has made these transformative investments, it's been by accident. The railroad companies that the government subsidized were the ones that went belly up. The transcontinental railroad that was really successful was the one that was privately funded. Now, this doesn't mean that I think we just sit back and sit on our hands and wait for private markets to take care of this problem either. But the point is that we need to say something more than we're going to have the government engage in or embark in a very aggressive investment strategy, and that will necessarily give us the technologies. If we want an Apollo project for clean energy technologies, which at a certain conceptual level I kind of like, we have to explain or have some reason to believe that that's going to succeed where the Syn Fuels Corporation failed. And if we want to give out $80 billion a year, Washington can easily give out $80 billion a year, but will we get much for it? Will we get the sort of things that not only that we want, but more importantly that we need if we are going to have the sort of planet that we want to live on? And there may be some ways of doing that. I'm not sure that direct strategic investments planned through the political process are the way to do it, but there are some things that might be worth putting on the table. One model might be the way that the National Science Foundation and the NIH and certain other government institutions give out grants in a politically insulated manner, where there's peer review, where there is a mechanism that tries to make the doling out of money as far removed and as different from, say, the earmarking appropriations process as possible. And certainly in certain contexts that works well. It certainly works very well when we're talking about basic scientific research. Does it work as well when we're talking about things that we hope to be able to commercialize? I'm not so sure, but perhaps. Another model might be certainly once we have something, a prototype, but we want to see it used more widely, the use of government procurement rules, which also have a series of mechanisms that insulate them the way, for example, traditional energy subsidies don't. Maybe that plays an important role. I mean, if economies of scale are the real reason why certain new technologies aren't yet cost competitive, certainly government procurement rules could play a role. The approach that I happen to be most enamored with is the one that the British Empire used when it realized that existing navigation technologies were woefully insufficient for an island state that sought to control the seas and dominate international trade, which is the use of prizes. And that is, it's the same principle that underlies our patent system, which is the idea that if we really want explosions of innovation and recognize that what makes innovation so valuable is the fact that it's not planned, it's not expected. We can't just put a bunch of experts in the room and expect them to come up with a solution. We need to provide super competitive returns and make those returns open to whomever is crazy, brilliant, or both enough to innovate the thing that we need. And for a period of time, prizes were quite successful. They certainly helped solve some of the British Empire's, or meet some of the British Empire's needs. Over time, they lost favor, not so much because of their lack of effectiveness, but because they did not suit certain political needs. But maybe some combination of these are needed. And one thing I would certainly encourage Ted and Michael to do is to put a lot more thought into, if we're going to put this sort of money on the table, can we do it in a way that is going to be more successful than the money we have poured into renewable energies in the past, alternative energy sources in the past, that has largely not gotten us the sorts of thing that we want. The last thing I want to put on the table, because I'm very close to speaking longer than I wanted, is something that in climate change we need to talk about. And I think the environmental movement, for a variety of reasons, has a difficult time talking about, in part because of some of what Ted was talking about in terms of our conception of nature and humanity's relation to the planet. And that's this. We know with certainty that if the climate models are correct, if we accept all the things that make us believe that global warming is a particularly large problem, and I certainly believe that it is, we know that some component of that problem is hardwired into the system at this point. Some amount of climate change we will experience, and some human contribution to climate change we will experience because of the emissions that have already occurred and the emissions that are going to occur, even if the United States was wiped off the face of the earth tomorrow. And that means we need to think, in addition to, how do we stabilize atmospheric concentrations of greenhouse gases over the next century, how do we have this sort of institutional frameworks and institutional means of, in this country and probably more importantly in other parts of the world, to adapt to changes that are coming whether we like it or not. And that's something that is rarely part of the climate discussion. I mean, there was an article, in fact, in Nature, I guess late last year, calling on folks that care about this issue to put this front and center. It's politically difficult to talk about. It's difficult for a lot of the interest groups that are involved in climate issues to talk about, but it's of immense importance. And if we just want to look in the United States, for example, the area where the United States is which is well prepared for a lot of climate changes compared to, say, Bangladesh or Bolivia or India. But one area where we are clearly woefully unprepared is, for example, water supply. Our existing water institutions, particularly in the western United States, but even in other parts, we see the fight that Georgia is having with its neighbors over water, can't deal with existing water demands, let alone the changes in both water demand and supply that a changing climate will produce. And if we don't put that on the table as well, it won't matter what we've managed to achieve emissions-wise 50, 100 years from now, because in the interim we'll be suffering through a lot of things that we're not prepared to deal with. Thank you.
We certainly have a lot to talk about. It looks like, in particular, they break down sort of into two clumps. One is the critique of the environmental movement of the past, and the other is where do we go from here? So there's probably room for lots of questions. I'd like to open it up for questions if anyone has any. I might start out with one of my own. What do we do about China and India? How does the Apollo project that you've proposed, which is a massive innovation into new energy, funded publicly and privately, as I understand it, but how does that then transfer to China and India?
Well, I think that there are sort of two frameworks for thinking about that. I mean, one is that, really at the end of the day, in terms of global climate change, the only thing that matters, really the only thing that matters, is developing clean energy technologies that are cost competitive with current energy technologies in real, deployed, unsubsidized terms in places like China and India. Like whatever combination of regulatory, pricing, investment, and technology policies we put in place in the U.S., it is our belief that is actually the end that they need to serve, is not only sort of driving clean energy technologies into the market here, and driving clean energy to the cost and performance of clean energy technologies to the point at which they can be cost competitive here, but doing so to the point at which they can be cost competitive in the developing world as well. And then I think the other framework is, is that this needs to be understood as a shared development investment at a global level, and a partnership between the developed and the developing worlds to transfer technology and resources in ways that are essentially sort of win-win. So one of the other concerns we have with the current international framework through what's called the Clean Development Mechanism is we think that a framework that sort of basically is set up such that developed world economies increase their energy costs in order to subsidize clean energy, essentially subsidize the productivity of developing economies that in many situations are economic competitors, is going to create an enormous political problem for that framework. So, you just imagine a Lou Dobbs when he starts talking about, your congressman raised your energy prices in order to send your job to China. That's going to be very problematic. So we think that a sort of shared development framework that clearly has economic benefits for both the developed and developing world in however that sort of process of technology transfer is going to happen is necessary. And we have often sort of suggested that something more like the formation of the European Union, which was originally the European Steel and Coal Partnership, I believe is what it was called. And it was, much of the focus has been on the shared investment in rebuilding the German steel industry, but it was also an energy partnership and sort of sharing energy resources, which became the basis for what is now the sort of most sort of powerful economic sort of bloc in the history of the world. So, and it's interestingly that that the Bush administration proposed a something like this in the was the Asian Pacific. I'm blanking on what they Clean Energy Fund. But I think, of course, and this has been our sort of critique of, that there's been a lot of talk about this framework from some parts of, particularly from the Bush administration, but there's just been no commitment to providing the kind of resources that would be necessary to make it a reality. That's the case with both domestic technology investment and with a sort of global partnership with China and others to create a framework that might succeed.
If I could permit myself a follow-up, and then please jump up and down if you have a question. But my question then goes straight to, I think, a question probably floating in the air out there is, and where does the money come from? Which your Lou Dobbs point makes very well. If it's all our money, then what?
Well, I mean, the money could come from a couple of places. I mean, the first place that the money could come from is through auctioning pollution allowances, which is what cap and trade does. We sort of think cap and trade needs to be sort of deconstructed and reconstructed. That really it should be understood as a way to generate investment funding for innovation, not just here, but also possibly in a U.S., China, and Europe partnership. That it's actually that's the part of it that's going to be more dynamic and that's going to drive the transition to a clean energy economy faster than the cap will. So that's one way. Another way is just to do an outright tax, which economists prefer because there's all sorts of implementation problems with cap and trade.
So as between carbon tax and cap and trade, you're tax people.
We're neutral.
Please don't call me a tax person. I'm still hoping to have dinner. I'm still hoping Jonathan's going to take us out to dinner afterwards.
And pick up the tab.
Yes, question.
I recently attended a conference when the British Energy Secretary, I think he was, attended and talked about their cap and trade system and how it was improving their global climate change and also research for alternative energies. I don't know if you've looked at that and whether that's a feasible system for the U.S. or not.
Well, this is the sort of the story that Europeans like to tell, is that they kind of go, they implemented their first round of their cap and trade system in 2005, and the carbon price went up to a very high number. I think it went up to like 40 euros, and then it quickly dropped to under a single euro. Basically, the price of carbon ended up being nothing. And they sort of explain it. They sort of explain it in a couple ways. They kind of go, well, we were just sort of getting the system, getting all the kinks worked out of the system. And then, of course, in classic European form, they ended up blaming the Italians in the end. Well, the Italians, messed it up. They gave away too many pollution allowances. We don't think either of those explanations is quite right. And there's an underlying factor, which is that governments, whether it's European governments or ours, are going to be under pressure to keep energy prices low. In other words, the fear is that if you go and raise energy prices too high in Europe, some companies in Europe are going to leave, and they're going to set up shop elsewhere. You're going to get a competitive disadvantage if you raise the cost of operating in those countries. So there's going to be constant pressure on policymakers to, on the one hand, look like they're really doing something about climate change by establishing a price for carbon. On the other hand, there's going to be a lot of pressure, not just from industry, but also on the part of consumers who don't want to see their electricity and gas prices go any higher. And that dynamic, even in sort of supposedly enlightened, ecologically enlightened Europe, that is also the case.
Can I add one thing to that? Just because I think it's amusing, but there was a great article published, I believe, last year that was entitled "Bush Saves Kyoto." I might not have been the title, might have been one of the subtitles. But the argument basically is that if Bush had just gone ahead and signed Kyoto and gotten it ratified, and we'd have just gone and done what everyone else did, which is just not actually complied with it, as is the case, in much of Europe and Canada and Japan, everyone would have had to deal with the reality that the framework just really isn't working, isn't going to work, and isn't going to get us where we need to go. But instead, the sort of global community really sort of characterized by literally the delegates at the Bali thing literally booing the U.S. Negotiator for sort of failing to agree to a binding carbon cap globally, binding emission standards, has sort of gotten us into this situation where literally the rest of the world just sort of, it's very easy for everyone, including American environmentalists and EU policymakers, to sort of say, well, this is just all the U.S.'s fault and all Bush's fault. And the reality is that literally nobody is actually succeeding in reducing their emissions under this framework, and you really can't blame the U.S. And the Bush administration for that.
Okay. Question in the back.
Yeah, along those lines, then, I want to ask the question of, obviously it's important to offer the carrot to have both companies and individuals change their behavior. But if I can use an analogy, I mean, you look at television and you look at the advertising from Toyota alone, right? The company that produces the Prius, arguably one of the most successful green products that's been launched on that scale. But yet, at the same time, they'll advertise the Sequoia, right? One of the largest SUVs around. And so I see that at least the failings or the potential failings, given human behavior and human nature, is that the carrot will create an incentive for some people to do the right thing and take their behavior in a way that reduces carbon and carbon usage. And some companies will respond to that, as they will, because there's profit to be made there. But the problem is going to be that there'll be a large portion of the population that will only respond not to the carrot but to a stick that says, until Toyota is prohibited from marketing a vehicle that gets less than 35 miles to the gallon or 50 miles per gallon, we won't have any fundamental change. So where's the discussion about the stick in this?
Right. Well, here's the problem with here's where the stick has limits, which is that we live in a democracy. So the people applying the stick to the American people are the American people. So the Chinese, if the Chinese are going to apply the stick, it's going to be the Chinese who are applying the stick. So in other words, we agree to do certain things like raise fuel economy standards or have air and water regulations, but they have to have support from the public. And the whole point of us referring to the the low level of support for action on global warming compared to much higher support for and higher concern on energy prices in the economy is to demonstrate that you're just going to have a problem there. I mean, that goes a long way to explaining why, it's even, like my mom went to go buy a hybrid, and she was looking at either the Prius or the Honda Accord hybrid, and I was like, Mom, why'd you get the Honda? My mom's a good liberal Democrat, NEA negotiator, loves Barack Obama. I was like, Mom, why'd you get the Honda Accord hybrid? She's like, well, I just love the power. There's so much more power in it. So, I mean, that's not to say that, it's just hopeless. But it is to say that, I think we're going to get some efficiency, we're going to get some conservation, we're going to get some, we're going to get some stick. But even if you look at, the CAFE standard increase that was just passed, it's just ecologically irrelevant. It's just not going to have the big breakthroughs. That's why so much of our focus is on technology innovation to drive down the price of clean energy.
Okay, question?
Well, before I go, I had a comment looking at 4 bottles of water from environmentalists.
I can comment on that, if you'd like. This was placed here for me to drink, and I'm thirsty. But if you're talking about the corporatization of the bottled water market. Yeah.
Only before there were bottled water.
Sure. I mean, but the issue that I'm raising here is that is really the one I brought up in the end, which is that the analysis, I think, here really does need to take into account the role of the corporation and corporate power in shaping the world we live in, hence the bottled water, which is a municipal resource that's been sold back to us at the price of $2 a gallon. This is bottled in Denver or Milwaukee, probably. It's just tap water.
He's had his hand up there for.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Thank you.
I've been watching the presidential debates, and the candidates' suggestions for global warming are pretty weak. If you guys were advising the 4 candidates that were left, what would you suggest to them as something that's practical that the government could do that could convince Joe American that this is a problem and this is what we need to do?
I'd tell them to stop talking about global warming. These guys can read a poll as well as we can, and they do a lot more of them than we do. And, the reality is that, first of all, if you look at what they spend more of their time talking about, they spend a lot more time talking about their clean energy investment agenda than they do talking about their commitment to capping carbon emissions. And in fact, if you just looked at, what, at least on the Democratic side, what the 2 Democratic candidates are demanding is exactly what the environmental movement has asked for, which is 80% reductions by 2050. So, and it's a throwaway line when they use it at all, and then they move on to talking about things that people care about. They've sort of satisfied the environmental sort of constituency. They've said what they have to say, and then they get on talking about things that really are high priorities and that people are going to actually base their vote on. So, in our original work around Apollo, our objective was to get the things that we need to do to address climate change out of the environmental ghetto in terms of public opinion and move it and reorient it around things that people really care about. National security, the future of the economy, energy costs and energy independence. Here in Ohio, you guys are about to have a big primary, and that primary is, that primary is largely going to be fought, certainly on the Democratic side, and probably again in the general in November, around who has a better plan for the economy and for the future of the economy and for the future of, particularly a whole set of communities here that have just been sort of devastated by the sort of deindustrialization of the U.S. economy. If I were giving them advice, I would say put that, I mean, as opposed to 2004 when we tried to get John Kerry to talk about this, and he informed us that, he had his little energy security box where he had some environmental regulations, and then he was going to go talk about the economy sort of separately over here, and now at least both candidates have somewhat significant sort of clean energy, economic, and investment policies. But it's our view that this is very good, that if it's done right, it's very, very good politics, and it provides a sort of larger vision for the country that's not just about sort of putting more money in your wallet today, but around kind of investing in a collective economic future that is absolutely critical, not just to sort of saving the planet, but to our sort of future prosperity and economic security.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful note on which to end. And I know our authors will be here if you have follow-up questions, but I think we've
We have a
had
reception right on the other side of this, upstairs.
there'll be a reception upstairs if you want to continue the discussion. Thank you very much.